red man should know that moral responsibility could not be applied to children. In fact, moral responsibility was to be regarded the mature effect of a development out of the infantile predispositions. Moral responsibility is here presented by Freud as a certain degree of self-control which seemingly supports readings of Freud that focus on the development of a mature autonomous ego. Yet Freud adds an important footnote to what he tells to the red man. And the footnote says, "I only produced these arguments so as once more to demonstrate to myself their inefficacy." Hence Freud at the same time had strategic therapeutic reasons to tell his patient what he told him, a strategy that is afterwards considered inefficient. In fact, he does believe that in a way his patient is responsible for the evil traits of his character, also when these traits are infantile derivatives. A few years later, Freud returns to this issue when he writes, "Even if a man has repressed his evil impulses into the unconscious and would like to tell himself afterwards that he is not responsible for them, he is nevertheless bound to be aware of this responsibility as a sense of guilt whose basis is unknown to him." Freud is saying here that a person cannot be absolved from moral responsibility by dissociating a part of himself, assigning the evil impulses to a past infantile state, or to the will of the gods as exalted disguises of his own unconscious, which amounts to the same thing in a sense. The sense of guilt will betray him, revealing that the evil impulses are really a person's own impulses. The issue of moral responsibility is a central theme in a 1925 text in which Freud elaborates some additional notes on dream interpretation. Moral responsibility for the content of dreams. Freud argues that when dreams have given no offense to dream censorship, they express immoral, incestuous and perverse impulses, or murderous and sadistic lusts, as he calls it. He then poses the following question: must one assume responsibility for the content of one's dreams? And his answer is this, I quote, "Obviously, one must hold oneself responsible for the evil impulses of one's dreams. What else is one to do with them? Unless the content of the dream, rightly understood, is inspired by alien spirits, it is a part of my own being. If I seek to classify the impulses that are present in me according to the social standards into good and bad, I must assume responsibility for both sorts. And if, in defense, I say that what is unknown, unconscious and repressed in me is not my ego, then I shall not be basing my position upon psychoanalysis. I shall not have accepted its conclusions. It is true that in the metapsychological sense, this bad, repressed content does not belong to my ego, that is, assuming that I am a morally blameless individual, but to an id, upon which my ego is seated. But this ego developed out of the id forms with it a single biological unit. It is only a specially modified, peripheral portion of it, and it is subject to the influences and obeys the suggestions that arise from the id." End of quotation. I want to make two remarks on this answer of Freud to the question, must one assume responsibility for the content of one's dreams? Firstly, in this passage we see that the metapsychological distinctions, such as those between id, ego and superego, can be misleading, notably when the ego is associated with good and the id with evil or bad. To recall, in the case of the red man, Freud did make such simple simple distinction. Freud now argues that one should not lose from sight that id and ego, and part of the ego is of course also the superego, or ego is part of superego, form a biological unit, and that the ego is nothing but a modified portion of the id. Psychoanalysis is therefore not about applying the distinction between a good, healthy ego and the evil id in a psychology that aims at strengthening the ego's control over the id. For associating good with the ego and evil with the id will strengthen defense mechanisms that on the one hand will consist of projections, I am not responsible for the dream, but some alien force is, and on the other hand sustain narcissistic illusionary wishful thinking, I, ego, am good. Freud argues that the ethical narcissism of humanity should be contented with both the evidence of his moral nature and his evil nature. Whoever would like to be better than he was created will probably attain nothing more than hypocrisy and inhibition. Hence one should hold oneself responsible for the content of the dream, not because the mature ego ought to be morally strengthened against and in control of the id, but because ego and id are a single biological unit, or better even, because the ego is only a specially modified peripheral portion of the id. It is merely the id's surface, so to speak. The recognition of the biological unity of ego and id implies this decentering of the ego. That's my first point. Secondly, the answer to the question whether one must assume responsibility for the content of one's dream reflects Freud's earlier ideas from Thoughts for the Times on War and Death. Surely he writes of holding oneself responsible for the psychological truth of one's evil nature, the evil in the id, and yet he also clearly mentions that the concepts of good and evil are present in me according to social standards. That is to say, according to the relation of the impulses to the needs and demands of the human community. The human impulses are in themselves neither good nor bad, but labeled as such according to what is perceived in society as the major hindrance to civilization, namely the constitutional inclination of human beings to be aggressive towards one another. So Freud is not only saying that one must honestly hold oneself responsible for the content of the dream, because the dream is one's own dream and not someone else's dream. He also reasons that one must assume responsibility for the classification of this content according to social standards. I think in order to grasp what Freud is talking about here, one should bear in mind an earlier remark he had made on moral responsibility for the content of dreams. It is easier to accept responsibility for the evil content of dreams when one distinguishes between psychic reality and material reality, that is, when one distinguishes between the evil thought and the evil act. In our text, Freud takes up this train of thought when he writes that he will leave it to the jurist to construct for social purposes a responsibility that is artificially limited to the metapsychological ego. When it comes to the question of practical consequences, Freud is well aware of the difficulties of deriving rules for social responsibility that take into account both the moral and evil nature of man. Hence, rules that clarify, so to speak, without condemnation and hence without repression or dissociation of certain aspects of human nature. In order to find the correct formula for the relation between good and evil in human nature, for a thorough assessment of one's motives, needs and desires, one should, according to Freud, accept the social standards of good and evil. Yet the process of reflection that includes social standards can only bring self-knowledge when the evaluation of the human condition is disconnected from immediate moral action and moral fault. and when the reflection does not turn into severe sense of guilt, condemnation, rejection, or dissociation. There's just always a certain mildness called for in such self-evaluation, that in my opinion reminds of Freud's view of the superego in his essay on humor, written a few years later, when evil can both be recognized as well as put into perspective by a superego that avoids attacking the ego, but in fact supports certain tolerance of opposites, such as good and evil, or at least bad and not that bad. Acceptance of moral standards does not imply subsequent adaptation to these standards. Moral responsibility as holding oneself responsible for one's evil wishes and desires is first of all about a truthful evaluation of one's nature and a deconstruction of hypocrisy on the one hand and of neurotic constructs on the other hand. That is, I think, Freud's general position in this text on moral responsibility for one's dreams. The truth, as Freud would call it, is somewhere in the middle. Moral responsibility in the Freudian sense is about questioning the possibility of socialization in civilization in view of one's evil nature as exposed by social standards of good and evil. And even after that, the answers to the question, what ought I to do or how should I behave, are still suspended. When we think of thoughts for the times on war on death or civilization and its discontents, Freud rather focuses on two things that result from such self-knowledge. Firstly, the knowledge of fellow men as the one who also has an evil nature, hence as the one who is not better or worse than me. And secondly, a critique of the severity of society's ethical demands. But that does not lead us directly to an adaptation of shared norms and values. That's my paper. Thank you very much.
Like this. Are there questions? Yes, please. Sorry, I don't know. Make it work.
Thank you so very, very much for your talk, and it was very illuminating to follow through Freud's earlier and later work, the kind of moves he made in terms of distinction between good and evil and acceptance or not acceptance and social standards and so on. What I was wondering about is that you approached your question more in terms of, may I say, classification, that these two terms exist and how does Freud handle them. Mm-hmm. But perhaps one can ask it in a slightly different way. One can think about the notion of evil, let's say, in Kantian terms. And think about evil in the Kantian terms on the one end, and think of evil in another way at the end, let's say the Arendtian way of the banal evil. And if one tries to think about the notion of evil not as something eternally given, is Freud's notion of evil that you categorize really still the Kantian term of evil? Or isn't something happening with the notion of evil that you're tracing the moves of acceptance, not acceptance, social standards, not social standards, would not become so relevant if we would actually know what Freud means by it and is after?